Hey, apologies if you saw my previous stream. It just crashed, unfortunately. Yeah, that sucked. I'm not sure if I perhaps had the settings for Resident Evil Village up too high. But yeah, what we do is I will just switch to going through this article. Only take about 15-20 minutes, and then I will go back to playing it. And I think I'm going to switch back down to normal, because I think hardcore mode was just a little bit too difficult, as you'll see if you watch my stream from a couple hours ago. But anyway, let's jump into this article. So I had a little bit of good news yesterday, a couple of days ago in the UK. The LGB Alliance, I think that co-founder, has been fighting to ban trans women from women's single-sex spaces. This has been a very common talking point in the media for the last 3 years, since the Gender Recognition Act consultation was first drawn up. And it's often just down to the discussion is that it's putting women and young girls at risk from harm, obviously. Obviously from harm is what I mean. And the problem with that is there is zero evidence that I have seen. Now, I'm not saying there is, that I'll amend that. There is no evidence that I have seen, any studies from the countries that allow this, which is the UK. The UK has allowed trans people to use the facilities that match their gender identity for years. It's covered under the Equality Act, as per here, Equality Act 2010. I think in there's a provision that it's regarding discrimination. So you can't discriminate, a service provider can't discriminate against someone due to a protected characteristics. And that characteristic in this case is gender reassignment. Gender reassignment covers anyone who is intending, so is yet to, or has and is currently undergoing transition. So that doesn't have to be medical. It can be purely social. As I said, it could also be that you're just intending to. It doesn't have to be that you have started. Just by intending to, you are protected under the Equality Act. And I say there is a separate thing which is often mentioned in relation to it. So that's the Gender Recognition Act. And the Gender Recognition Act is what allows someone to obtain a certificate to say, no, this is my legal sex, because unfortunately there is no way to segregate currently. There's no way to segregate sex and gender in that. To change your gender legally, you change your sex marker on your birth certificate, which is what the Gender Recognition Act allows you to do. And that's what, if you look at one of my previous streams, I went over the process of that and the results of the consultation into whether or not that process should be made easier. So without further ado, let's go into the article. So a judge has refused permission for a judicial review of the Equality and Human Rights Commission's guidance on the Equality Act 2010. Throwing out the attempted judicial review today, Mr. Justice Henshaw, sitting in London's High Court, said the case was unarguable and that its interpretation of the Equality Act 2010 is wrong in law. The failed judicial review was sought by LGB Alliance co-founder Anne Sinnott, who crowdfunded more than $96,000 in legal fees. That's quite a lot of money. It concerned the EHRC's guidance on single-sex exemptions in the Equality Act 2010. So that's the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It's abbreviated. Which allow women's single-sex spaces, like prisons or refuges, to only exclude trans women in certain specific circumstances. So from memory, there's a clause in there that, as I said before, gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. So me being a trans woman would be able to enter a women's refuge or the bathroom, and I am protected under that. However, there is a clause in there that allows a service provider to exclude a trans person. So say me, if it's it's a means to achieve a legitimate aim. There has to be a reasonable case there. There has to be some sort of evidence to back up that concern, and you can't just do it on a whim. You can't just say, well, we don't want trans people in this space. So the default is that trans people should be allowed in these single-sex spaces, and that's the current law. However, what they were arguing, Sinner argued that any women's single-sex space with a trans woman becomes a mixed-sex space, and therefore the EHRC's code of practice was unlawful because it told service providers to treat trans women as women in most situations. Her argument was that trans women, with or without legal gender recognition, so that's the GI Act that we're talking about to get the GRC, the certificate, should always be excluded from women's single-sex spaces. So she's arguing that trans people, it's very focused on women here, but trans people should always be excluded from the spaces that match their gender identity. That's her argument that she's put forwards. And the reason is because currently the EHRC's guidance is that they should be accepted unless you've got a good reason as to why not. Justice Henshaw had heard from Dan Squires QC, representing the EHRC, that there is no evidence that on the basis of the code of practice, someone has acted unlawfully. It is not appropriate for a court to say that trans women should always be excluded. If there is a problem, then it can be challenged and the court can judge if a service provider has done it wrong. That seems fair to me. Apply everyone equally until something comes up and assess that case-by-case basis. While throwing out the attempted judicial review, Henshaw said, "The Code of Practice seeks to give concise and practicable advice. The claimant has shown no arguable reason to believe the Code has misled or will mislead service providers about their responsibilities under the Act in order to place women or girls at risk." He added, "I recognise the concerns that women and girls and those who help to protect their interests have about the application of the gender reassignment provision in a particular context. However, it is, in my view, clear beyond argument that Parliament has chosen to place transsexuals in a different position to persons of their birth sex. Trans and non-binary people are protected from discrimination under the Equality Act's protected characteristic of gender reassignment," so this is what we were talking about earlier, "while women are protected by the protected characteristic of sex. The EHRC's case was that it did not agree that it is always going to be justified as a matter of fact to exclude trans women," Squires told the court. "Our submission is if there are words, apparently I can't read. Our submission is if there are specific instances where trans inclusion is the practice, which is increasingly common. It is, if that's unlawful, someone can bring a challenge to that and say we should not be allowing trans women, with or without a GRC, into this space. Then the court should decide. On that case, I would add, I think is what he's saying. That's my addition, but I believe what they're saying is it's, I think based on above, is that it's a case by case, not abstract and theoretical arguments about service providers. Okay. Representing Sinhut, Jeremy Haim, QC, argued that the EHRC's guidance for service providers on how to interpret the Equality Act in relation to single-sex spaces put women and girls at risk because trans women, quote, are men. So, yeah, that's obviously not brilliant. There's two ways of reading that. So, either they're saying trans women are men in terms of gender, in which case that is a transphobic comment. It's not being that they aren't necessarily transphobic themselves. It's a transphobic comment. You're denying someone's identity. You're assigning them a identity you think they are, not what they actually are. Or it's referring to sex, and sex and gender get mixed up all the time. So if it's the latter, if it's referring to sex, I would say that this is still very much, out there. Sex. So, okay, if I take, for example, myself, I'm a trans woman. I was assigned male at birth. So my sex is what it is. So perhaps it would be easier if we go into a definition of perhaps what sex is, because often what I suspect is being used here, I suspect they're talking about sex and, quote, biological sex. So from what I understand, when people say biological sex, they're talking about someone's chromosomes. So that's XX or XY. So male or female, and that is who you are. Now, in that context, I would say, yep, let's just assume my chromosomes, because no one's actually checked them, but let's assume, because you can get variations, but let's assume, yep, I am male if you were to read just my chromosomes. So in that term, then yes, like I am male when you're talking about sex, but that's a very simplified definition of sex. Sex isn't as simple as just what your chromosomes are. And it does no one any favours to simplify it down to this arbitrary definition. So previously, often people would say, it's what between your legs. And, a lot of feminists have argued that does not make someone, who they are. So that's not what makes someone a woman. So we're going to gender here, but that's not what makes someone a woman. Now, you could, even with sex, you've got secondary sexual characteristics. So some people might define someone as a male or female purely based on those, but what if they have different chromosomes? What if their hormones are, and you might say, well, how do they then have those characteristics with different chromosomes? But again, it's not as simple. So there's various things can influence someone. You have intersexed people. Hormones play a massive role in someone's development of sex. I think rather than repeating on, I will link to this. I won't read through this all now, but this goes on to talk about sex and so you see here. So everyone learned that if you've got XX and you're female, if you've got XY, you're male. So as I said, yep, technically by that definition, if I have XY, then yes, I'm male. However, it's very simplified to talk about it in these terms. So you've got intersex people, and you then also have this group of cells called the bipotential primordium and a gene called SRY. A newly fertilized embryo initially develops without any indication of its sex. At around 5 weeks, a group of cells clump together to form the bipotential primordium. These cells are neither male nor female, but have the potential to turn into testes, ovaries, or neither. After the primordium forms, SRY, a gene on the Y chromosome discovered in 1990, thanks to the participation of intersex XX males and XY females, might be activated. Though it is still not fully understood, we know the SRY plays a role in pushing the primordium towards male gonads. But SRY is not a simple on-off switch. It's a precisely timed start signal, the first chord of the male gonad symphony. A group of cells must all express SRY at the right time. Without that first chord, the embryo will play a different symphony, female gonads or something in between. Again, so that sounds more like a spectrum, right? Depending when this signal kicks in. And again, I'm under no illusion. This is simplifying stuff still. Like, I suspect I am no biologist. But these things get very complicated. And as they admit to here, where's the line? Yeah, we still don't fully understand this stuff. We need more research. But to boil sex purely down to the chromosomes of XX or XY is a huge oversimplification. So just to finish on this, I'd say this is a really good article. I would recommend reading it. I hope it didn't, because I didn't actually want to click on that. There are links all over here to other studies. I would recommend reading some of them if you have time. I appreciate it is a lot of reading, but even if you just read this, it's quite interesting. It goes on to talk about the classic male and female brain, and actually perhaps how there isn't such a thing. I would highly recommend reading it. So if we just tie back to this, so okay, let's benefit of the doubt, say they're talking about sex. Well, they're talking about sex in a very, very, very restricted sense. So it's very interesting. And now, you can make the argument, well, what does sex refer to in law then? What's the definition of sex in law? And that's a very good question. I would leave that to the legal experts. But it isn't as simple as just your chromosomes. So whilst you could argue that is factually true for sex based on purely your chromosomes, it's a misrepresentation of science, of how sex works. So, and if they were talking about gender, well, then that is just transphobic, because you are assigning someone a different gender identity. So you're telling someone who they are. That's about their identity. So walking around, the phrase trans women are women, it's about someone's gender. It's not talking about someone's sex. And this is often where, so J.K. Rowling is an example of this. So, and again, these are my views that I'm not talking for anyone else other than myself. But that's my understanding of that phrase, because often, as I was about to say, you'll get people make the claim that trans people are denying that sex is a thing. They're trying to erase sex, is often a phrase that's used. Now, that's one of the quotes that J.K. Rowling tweeted. Now, the reason that's so hurtful to people is because it's a straw man. As the people I've come across, and most of the arguments online, people aren't denying the existence of sex. Sex is real. Like that's not a question. That's just, nip that one in the bud. Sex is real. It is a thing. No one's saying it isn't. Let's move on. I think the interesting question is, perhaps it's more complex than a lot of people realise, because society, as for decades, hundreds of years really, even if you put aside gender, sex has always been, not always necessarily, I don't know enough to say that, but majority has been seen as male or female. There is, and obviously you have intersex, but often they are viewed as something other, which is sad, because it's just our lack of understanding. And that's the same as gender, right? Trans people have, until relatively recently, been seen as people with a mental illness. So gender dysphoria, or gender identity disorder, which is what it was previously referred to, was actually categorized as a mental illness. But it was declassified as such, because people realized it's not. It's your identity. Your identity is not a mental illness. And while we're exploring more and more about gender, sex is also something that is much more complicated. And unfortunately, they are confused all the time. And part of it is the language we use. So I'm sure you'll hear me when I'm speaking sometimes are, you conflate male and man and female and woman, because often male and female actually is referring to someone's sex. Man and woman is referring to someone's gender. And so if we just go back to the argument that people claiming there's this big push to try and erase sex, that's not a thing. So it's more complicated. I was going to go on to something else, but let's carry on with the article. So Hayam told the court that Senot's case was about protecting women, particularly vulnerable women like Muslim women. I'm not quite sure why specifically Muslim women. Is that for religious concerns? I don't know why that is. I don't know enough to make a comment on that. But that's interesting why Muslim women were singled out. And the EHRC's incorrect guidance meant that the service providers were not confident in applying the single-sex exemptions and consequently were undermining women's rights which are enshrined in law. So I think what's saying here is that they believe the EHRC is giving incorrect guidance in telling service providers that they should allow all trans people to enter the single-sex space that matches their gender identity. But they believe that means service providers are then hesitant or a bit concerned about applying those exemptions that mentioned earlier, because of the potential backlash. That's what I read into that. So it seems like they're suggesting that people are scared to perhaps use those exemptions for fear of backlash, basically, and consequently are then undermining women's rights. Now, again, how is it undermining women's rights? This is something I see all the time. Undermining women's rights, trampling on women's rights. What rights are being trampled on? I think my guess would be that it's safety, the right to have a single sex space, say in this case women, to be protected from men is how it is at the moment, right? You have men and you have women's toilets. So they believe by allowing trans people into those respective bathrooms, you are trampling on the rights, now arguably of both, right? Of men and women. But notice how it's always about women. And another thing I would point out here is if this went the other way, God forbid, that would be horrendous, but say it did. So that means trans men would have to use the women's toilets. Now, I'm not sure how comfortable then these same people would be about that, because trans men are men. So on the whole, I am generalizing here. People can look however the hell they want, but on the whole, they are probably going to look more masculine than they are feminine. So because of the way we tend to work as humans in sort of assessing someone's identity, often those people will, come across as their true identity, a man. So if their concern is about having men in their bathroom, well, this is going to have the same effect. So it's not logical. It doesn't make sense, and this is why it's frustrating. The focus is always on women, and actually, if you go back, the arguments are the same against gay people. That they're a danger. They're paedophiles. They are after our children. They're going to try and education in schools is trying to convert people to be gay. All of this absolute nonsense, and it's homophobia. And it's the same arguments against trans people. It's exactly the same. The trans agenda. So there's this massive lobby group that gets together and plans who we're going to trans next, and it's ridiculous. Like, most trans people and most people of any, and again, I can only speak, this is only my view of what people think. I'm not speaking for other people, but me, myself, I just want to be able to live my life and be happy and live as myself. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because a lot of trans people can't do that. And so I feel very fortunate to be able to have a supportive family, have a supportive group of friends, and be able to be who I am. But there are people who aren't so lucky, and say, being someone who has the opportunity to counter some of this misinformation, I feel like that's what I should try and do. Now, I might not be the best person ever at doing it, but I can give it my best. So let's finish this. So, but but Henshaw emphasised that trans men and women can already be excluded from single-sex services spaces on a case-by-case basis under exemptions in the Equality Act, if it would be a proportionate way of achieving a legitimate aim. There you go. That, I believe, is a quote from the actual Equality Act. So again, it has to be an actual reason. You can't just be excluding trans people from a space for no reason. So they just I think, so that's the end of the article. So they mentioned, I think, refugees at the top. So this here, again, understandable concern, right? I'm not calling anyone transphobic for raising that as a concern initially, right? That's a fair enough question. If you're someone who hasn't come across this topic much before, you don't know a lot about it, and suddenly you hear, maybe from your perspective, someone says, "Oh, can you believe they're just letting men who say they're women go into single sex spaces like refuges speak." That would be concerning, like off just literally off that. Now, this is what we're fighting. We're fighting in that misinformation, because it's how things are said and the misinformation that goes with it has a huge impact on majority of the population, because most people, this isn't a massive area of interest for them or massive concern. It doesn't affect them most of the time. So it's the headlines that they see, it's the one-liners, it's the things they hear from friends, and we need to combat that misinformation. So here, okay, so say someone was to raise that question, that concern, that, oh well, what happens with refugees and in prisons? How do you monitor that? What is there a higher risk now of people, of women in this case, being abused? Could it be used for nefarious means? Could someone pretend to be trans? Now, the thing is those people aren't trans is the key. If they are pretending to be trans, they're not trans. So excluding trans people is not really going to help anything. It's you're excluding an entire group of people based on potentially a very tiny minority who may try and take advantage of that. So let's just say it was possible, who may try and take advantage of that system. Okay, so first off, there is no evidence to suggest that is actually happening. So if you go to, in fact, we could refugees support for trans inclusion. So you can see there's a few articles talking about, oh, here we go. Oh, that's Pink News. So slightly, so that's not unsurprising from the Times as well. But that's given all of the rhetoric in the media for the past 3 years leading up to the consultation, or the results of it. So this might be a fairer one. So statement of support for the trans community. So this is Survivors Network. So who are these? So this is Survivors Network. It's the Rape Crisis Centre for Sussex. Who are we? Feminist organisation. So this sounds a fairly good source to get some info from, right? So what do they say? We are the Rape Crisis Centre for Sussex, and we have been supporting survivors of sexual violence for approaching 30 years. We are deeply concerned by the proposed rollback to safeguards for trans dignity and safety in this country, detailed in a recent Sunday Times article. So this is referring to about this time last year, there was a leak suggesting that this was before the consultation results were announced, and it was suggesting that they were going to scrap any ideas for reforming the Gender Recognition Act, and even then go as far as then coming up with some safeguards for single-sex spaces to prevent trans people from using them, which was very frightening at the time, not gonna lie. Now, I will just say it was just a leak, so there's no guarantee, but given that there was a huge amount of subsequent backlash, and then in the following September, they announced effectively no changes other than a change to the fee and moving it online, I am skeptical, if I'm honest, as to how much truth there could have been truth in that, because they did nothing, yet the consultation proved that the majority of the public who took part were in favour of reform. So yeah, anyway, if you're interested in the breakdown of that, then please watch my previous videos. And the effort to justify this rollback through supposed protections of services like ours and the women we work with every day. Our expert experience of supporting women and survivors of all genders has left us very worried about the potential impact of these plans on our clients, both cis and trans. We know, through groundbreaking research, that trans people are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence. We also know that transphobic hate crimes recorded by the police increased by 37% last year. This is a time where we should be coming together as a community to protect the most vulnerable in society, providing shelter and support. We are disappointed to see, instead, the government are proposing to disregard the outcomes of the Gender Recognition Act consultation and to further move to reduce the rights of trans people in our country. As highlighted by the organisation Mermaids, which are awesome charity, and you can donate to them in the links below the stream. Please do, if you have any money, and even if you don't, please just go and take a look at their website. They do some great work helping with children and trans children and teens, and supporting their families, which is crucial because often the families need support as well, and it's not necessarily just the trans person involved. Don't get me wrong, it's very important they get that support. I wish I had that support when I was growing up, but the families often need it too, and they are such a vital lifeline. So please, if you have anything you can spare, please donate to them. As I said, link below. All money bar a fee to PayPal goes direct to them. No money goes to me. So yeah, that would be very much appreciated. So as highlighted by the organisation Mermaids, trans people have been using toilets, trying on clothes in changing rooms, accessing domestic violence facilities, and generally getting on with their lives for as long as single-sex spaces have existed. And there is absolutely no evidence that we're aware of from the police, local authorities, shops, refuges, or anywhere else besides, that predators have used the provisions of the Equality Act 2010 to gain access to women's spaces. None. So these are reference with here we go. So we've got the hate crimes one, we've got supporting, and then we've got, does this have links to where those come from? No. But as I've said, I've not seen any studies that have indicated there has been an increase, and as Mermaid stated in their article, in fact, I was going to say it later in the stream, that trans people have been using single-sex spaces for decades, and there's been no public outcry. There's been no massive increase of violence towards women or men, and so it just makes us feel like a very fear-based argument, because there's no evidence to back it up. Like, again, as I said, I concede that it can be quite a natural reaction to someone who doesn't know anything about trans people and hears it from a friend or the media. That I completely understand that initial fear. Like that would be wrong of me to belittle someone's concern there. But what I encourage people to do, if you have those concerns, is to educate yourself. Education is so important, and you will find there is no evidence to support your concerns, and hopefully that makes you feel better. I'm not saying that suddenly means you'll be like, oh yeah, now I'm fully trans, and everyone come in. No one's, I mean, it'd be great if you are, don't get me wrong, but no one's asking for you to suddenly change your mind overnight. But it would be good if just read through some of the evidence out there and perhaps assess just what are the reasons that you feel uncomfortable. If there's no evidence for increased violence, then perhaps is it a justified concern? And hey, if you do some research and you find that actually there is some evidence for it, then please send it to me, and I'd be interested in going through that on stream and even discussing it with you, if you were so willing. So if we go back to this, we would like to reiterate this point and highlight that in the 10 years since the Equality Act 2010 came into place, we have not had a single issue in terms of survivor safety due to trans women being entitled to access our spaces. We also know all too well that predatory men are already able to enact their abuse with few repercussions, including entering changing rooms and public toilets. They do not need to pretend to be part of a marginalised community to break the law and violate women, and suggesting that they would do so is entirely unsubstantiated. So this is what I was saying before, right? That they can already do these things. This is what I was talking about. They don't need to. That's not trans people. They are not trans. So by marginalising trans people who are already marginalised, restricting them, all you're doing is actually hurting trans people. So it's not effective. And again, that there's even if there there's no evidence, so it doesn't make sense to do that. Where is it? Yeah, so that's it, I think. Oh no, I think it was I about to say something up here? Yeah, so all I'd say is this is direct from an organisation, right, who deal with this stuff day in and day out. So again, if you still have concerns, I'd argue get in contact with them and ask your questions. Maybe you've got a specific question, feel free to ask me on here, or contact these people directly who deal with these things. And so what I'd say, I haven't read the rest yet, but refugees, they have a lot of process to go through before someone's admitted. And to assume that just because then someone could pretend to be trans is then an easier way to get in, that's incorrect. They still have to go through exactly the same processes as any other person. So, yes, it's a flawed assumption and it's based on no reality. I remembered what I was going to say. So, this is it, right? Someone can already go into someone's changing rooms or the women's toilets. They don't need to pretend to be a woman to do so. In fact, someone could literally just walk in And if they wanted to try and have some defense, arguably they could put on some sort of high-vis jacket. They could pretend to be a plumber. They could pretend to be a mason. There's so much they could do, which is horrific, that someone could do. And are you going to outlaw every single one of those things? No. Because again, there's no evidence for that happening on a large scale, that people are putting on high-vis jackets and that's not the way to solve it anyway. As with all crime, in my view, or at least most crime, you should be trying to look at the underlying causes, the underlying reasons these crimes happen, and trying to work out ways of preventing them, better education at schools, giving better support to people who are in need. Education is the best weapon we have. And just sometimes, I mean, don't get me wrong, these are horrible things people do. I'm not defending them. But if we could try and look to help people who are unwell or are suffering with a certain issue, there's a myriad of reasons why people do the things they do, why anyone does anything. And if we can try and catch some of these reasons before someone commits a crime, then you're preventing that person's life being ruined, right? And again, I'm not arguing that they're equal or more important than the victim once they've committed the crime. Obviously, at that point, they've committed the crime, and the poor victim, that person should be judged accordingly. The offender should be judged accordingly. But if you can get to them before that point and try and help them, I'm not saying everyone necessarily can be helped, but if you can, then perhaps you could reduce it that way. Arbitrarily blaming a group of people for a specific thing that happens, which there's no evidence for, it's not going to solve anything. All it does is create more division. That's not helpful to anyone. So we are deeply concerned about the application of proposed tightening of access to single-sex spaces. There is no safe or survivor-centred way to police the anatomy of someone accessing a service or using a bathroom/changing room. This will impact on gender non-conforming cis people as well, particularly cisgender women as well as transgender women. So what they're talking about there is if a woman looks masculine, well, are they going to get challenged for going into the women's bathroom? Are they not going to be allowed? Do you see how it could start to actually encourage more discrimination? Yet you are supposed to be, they're the very people you're supposed to be protecting. So it's not effective. Policing gender expression and defining someone's womanhood by her conformity to state-sponsored specifications is an archaic practice that should not be considered in 2020, and is certainly not a feminist principle or one that will protect vulnerable women. This move will harm all women, but it is clear the intention is to functionally remove the ability of trans people to exist in public life. We consider trans-inclusive feminism to be key to our values and central to our services as a rape crisis centre. So I think I'll finish there on that. But you can see that there is no evidence to support these concerns. So as I said, if you have these concerns, please, and I haven't convinced you here, please do more reading, because what I would hope is naturally you'll become more comfortable over time, and become more accepting of it. So I think that was the end of the article. I think that, so just to summarize, the crux is that they don't believe that the law currently should allow, or is allowing, how it's written, trans people automatic access, and so therefore they believe the Equality and Human Rights Commission's advice on the law is incorrect, because the advice is that trans people should be included. However, this judge has refused permission for a review because they believe that that's an incorrect interpretation of the law. Their interpretation of the law is that actually yes, the default position is to include trans people. However, there is provision in there to exclude them for specific reasons in order to achieve a legitimate aim. That's it. A proportionate way of achieving a legitimate aim. So you can't just exclude a trans woman from the toilet in the supermarket just because it's not allowed. So that's a win. I would say that's a win, and that's a piece of positive news. Interesting highlighting. That's a piece of positive news. So, yay. And the other argument underlying there, sorry, I should say, is that trans women are implicitly a threat to cis women. And as I said earlier, there is nothing to show, and in terms of threat as well, I should probably define that. It's talking about a physical violent threat, sexual abuse, and you could argue as well just perversion, right? Someone going in who's just looking inappropriately at women. That's their concern. That's the underlying concern of that, and that's why they feel like women's rights are being trodden on. But again, there is no evidence for that.